Welcome to this segment of The Revolution Will Be Podcasted, brought to you by your hosts, Zeba, Kirby, and myself, Noah. During today's discussion, we'll be talking about the commonalities of revolutions in a bunch of different settings.
Specifically, we'll be commenting on the balance of each revolution's use of violence and rhetoric and how that affected the revolution.
Revolutions have occurred throughout history for many different reasons, but most commonly to overthrow an unjust government. It's a tool used as a way for common people to alter the government system that abuses the power that's held over them.
Usually the revolution starts because the revolters are trying to create a better society, or they're trying to overthrow the unjust government and represent themselves politically. Most of the time, the rebels have been successful with their goals and coming out victorious.
That reminds me of my favorite movie saga, Star Wars. The rebels always find a way to win, even though they're severely outnumbered. I guess they do have the Jedis on their side, though.
Exactly, Noah. The good guys always prevail.
Not really. Most failed revolutions aren't mentioned in the news or in many history books.
Yeah, I guess I never really thought about that.
Yeah, I guess that is a good point.
What do you guys think the differences are between a successful and unsuccessful revolution?
I definitely feel like a lot of it might have to do with the revolution's use of violence and physical action.
Yeah, in the New York Revolution game, I think it was pretty hard for the colonists. They had a lot of debate on how they're going to pay for their weapons, and I think just in general it would be hard in a revolution to afford to overthrow a government that obviously has those resources to suppress the people, and I think it would be hard for those people to fight back, but I think that's kind of where violence comes into place.
Yeah, again, just like Star Wars. The rebels only had fighter ships and foot soldiers compared to the Death Star, the Star Destroyer, and thousands of clone troopers.
I think a lot of revolutions have this exact problem. In 1900, the Boxer Rebellion was created. It was basically a secret society whose goal was to exterminate all the foreign devils in China. One of the main reasons why the Boxer Rebellion wasn't as successful as it could have been was because they had to use traditional Chinese weapons and even had to resort to using agricultural tools.
Yeah, that sounds pretty awful. It's like bringing a pitchfork to a shootout.
Yeah, from what I've read, it was indeed a terrible idea. The Boxers didn't even accomplish their revolutionary goals. It was a total flop.
Yeah, not only did they have to forfeit their group goals, but the Boxer Rebellion actually did the opposite of what it intended to do.
Yeah, exactly. Unfortunately for the Boxers, the revolt ended up uniting its enemies into the forceful Western powers and completely fragmented their own army.
In contrast to the Boxers, the American colonists used a lot of violence, or at least the threat of violence, against Loyalists and England. As expected, this was beneficial towards achieving independence.
Yeah, even though mobbing didn't always work or go our way during the span of the American Revolution game, it was really important during the actual revolution.
Yeah, I think that's a good point to keep in mind. I think during the initial stages of our revolution, the mobs forced the resignation of stamp distributors, and that's a pretty big move against one of the most international powers at the time, which was Britain.
Yeah, I can see how direct action like that can shape the outcome of a revolution. It certainly shows what they're willing to do and who they're willing to go against.
I have to say that although violence isn't the most optimal way anyone wants to implement change, it definitely has an impact.
Exactly. I would say in the French Revolution game, I felt that with the insisting pressure of the Austrian Empire and the rioting people of France, they were able to persuade the National Assembly into passing the legislation that they wanted with a certain quickness. Therefore, I think that the violence was extremely effective for getting the government in the people's control. And just overall, the crowd and section leaders attacking the members and the foreign armies advancing on Paris was just a lot more progressive towards getting their wants and needs.
Yeah, that's true. But we've really been going on a lot about violence. I think we should mention another layer of influence in revolutions, and that layer of influence is rhetoric.
In rebuttal to Kirby, I think rhetoric made more of an impact in the French Revolution game than violence. The amount of time we had to discuss topics and amendments to legislations like what group of women could join the National Guard, so stuff like that allowed more room to persuade other members of the National Assembly to accept our thoughts and ideas.
Definitely. I feel that even though violence can lead a rebellion and help meet your demands, I think it's useless without rhetoric. As you can see in the French Revolution, there was so much violence going on and just mobbing and executions all the time. But when it came time for them to actually make their demands, it was kind of difficult for them to do that and kind of select a leader once the king was overthrown. But then at that point, they put Napoleon, who kind of like took control and showed the rhetoric. But really, how did that end up with Napoleon being in charge? We obviously know that kind of ended poorly. But I also think rhetoric is obviously a very important part of revolutions.
Yeah, it definitely allows people to make others believe that things can get better. Then they're able to use that hope to convince those same people to fight to make society a better place.
Yeah, it's definitely a lot easier to convince people to revolt if they're desperate for things to change. We saw that exact example during the Revolution game as well, the American Revolution game, that is, with the slaves, laborers, and generally the poorer people of the game. They're much more willing to fight in the war than other people that had power and wealth and all that stuff.
Yeah, I would say that most revolutions are probably built on logos. They use facts and logic to try to convince people to follow their purpose of the revolution. I think that can be seen in the American Revolution, where the Patriots tried to convince people to rebel by how logical it would be, or how illogical it is that the English were taxing them for protection when they didn't want that protection in the first place, and kind of forced that war into their land. And I think that's how the revolution was so successful, was that all those people were like, yeah, this doesn't really make sense. Why are we being taxed so much for something that we didn't even really want to do?
Yeah,
and that's
exactly, yeah.
what led.
I kind of have to disagree. I feel like they used pathos more than anything. Like I said earlier, they inflict their audience with hope. The hope that they instill ignites people to make action and fight in revolutions. They also use emotions like fear to scare people into fighting because they're afraid of what might happen to them if they don't help fight in the revolution. Mobbing wasn't restricted to anyone, and the Patriots were able to use tactics like that to convince the moderates to fight in the American Revolution.
Actually, why can't you both be right? I think revolutions begin with the idea that government is acting irrationally, which leads people to think logically and use logos as a rhetorical device. And then once a revolution has actually started and got going, pathos is used to persuade people to actually join the cause, and based on like what fear is might come if they don't join. Princess Leia is actually famously quoted convincing Obi-Wan Kenobi to join the rebellion, saying,
"Help me, Obi-Wan Kenobi. You're my only hope."
Another Star Wars reference? Noah, really?
Yeah, I mean, the Rebel Alliance is as good as a revolutionary group as any.
Yeah, I think there's plenty of examples, both fictionally and historically. I would say something that came to mind originally for me was the Haitian Revolution. This is where the slaves were being treated really badly in Haiti, and they were having to farm all the sugar cane, and basically they realized that their conditions were so poor that they decided to revolt. And because they felt that it wasn't logical to be slaves anymore, and that they'd been working in such extreme conditions for basically nothing in reward. But I also think that grew a lot because the people were so afraid of what would happen if they didn't join the revolution or if they stood up against the revolution. And I think that's something that you were kind of saying earlier about it being both kind of logos and pathos.
Yep.
That they created that like fire that just kind of blazed through Haiti.
I guess we can all see that rhetorical intent and violence have both shaped the outcomes of events for many revolutions we have seen throughout history, whether they end up being successful or not.
Yeah, exactly. All right, guys. Well, I think that's going to wrap it up for today. That's pretty much all the time we have. Thank you guys for tuning in at home, and make sure to join us next time on The Revolution Will Be Podcasted.